and they lived happily ever after. The end. Evening, folks. I'm glad you're with us. I see we have a bunch here in the audience tonight, and also our viewers at home. You know, tonight we get to look at another unlikely hero. But, as I was reading, I love a good story, especially if the story has a happy ending. And tonight's lesson is such a story. It has a fantastic ending. But, before we dive into the story, let's look at some ancient history that sort of sets the stage for tonight's lesson. The year was 480 BC. A massive Persian army marched with untiring determination to face the rebel forces of Athens and its Greek allies. Ancient sources numbers the Persian host in the millions of men. Modern scholars believe it was probably in the hundreds of thousands. In any case, it was an impressive display of military might. At that time, the Persian Empire stretched from modern-day Libya in Africa to Pakistan in Asia. It was the largest empire in history up to the point, with about 50 million people residing within its borders. After being conquered the Babylonian Empire, the Persians settled into domination over the Middle Eastern world for 2 centuries. Initially, regions of Greece had been conquered by the Persians under Darius, but Darius' army had been defeated by the Athenians at the famous Battle of Marathon. Battle of Marathon. What do we know today that came out of the Battle of Marathon, you runners? Enraged and undetermined, Darius was determined to subdue his Greek enemies. Returning home, he began to amass a great army, but died before he was able to satisfy his thirst for vengeance. The quest for revenge fell to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes rose to power in 486. Upon taking the throne, the new ruler faced rebellions within his empire from Egypt and Babylon, which he effectively subdued. Xerxes, engaged with the revolt, was unable to immediately set his sights on Greece, but by 481 he was ready to attack. His forces numbered 250,000, and they were stationed in modern-day Turkey, waiting for the orders to cross into Greece. Eager to avenge his father's honor and pride of his power, Xerxes was confident of victory, especially since his army heavily outnumbered the enemy. But things didn't go as Xerxes expected. Though his armies reached Athens and sacked the city, the Greeks ultimately defeated the Persians and drove them out of Greece. Several dramatic battles made the unexpected Greek victory legendary. At the famous Battle of Thermopylae, a relatively small force of Greek soldiers was able to hold off a much larger Persian army for several days until their position was flanked and they were forced to retreat. In order to safeguard the returning Greek army, a group of 300 Spartans and several hundred others stayed behind and fought to the death. Their courageous last stand immediately became a rallying cry for the larger Greek cause and an iconic story of heroism throughout history. A month after Thermopylae, the Persian navy, which consisted of hundreds of warships, suffered a major defeat in the Battle of Salamis. Knowing they were outnumbered, the Greeks lured the Persians into the narrow straits of Salamis. In the cramped waterways, the size of the bulky Persian navy proved to be a major disadvantage as their fleet became unmanageable and disorganized. The Greek pounced on the advantage and destroyed some 300 Persian vessels. With much of his navy sunk, the vanquished Xerxes was forced to flee back to Persia with most of his army. The remaining Persian forces were finally defeated by the Greeks in August 479 at the Battle of Plataea. Against all odds, the Athenians and their allies vanquished a much larger invading army. Their victory marked a major turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars and shaped the history of Western civilization by pushing the balance of power through Greece under Alexander the Great. 150 years later, the Persian Empire was defeated for good. But what does this ancient history have to do with the Bible story tonight? Well, the emperor, who the Greeks call Xerxes, well, The English Bible transliteration, his name is Ahasuerus. He is the very king featured in the book of Esther. Yes, Esther is tonight's unlikely hero. In God's perfect provision, the man who tried to conquer Greece with at least 250,000 soldiers, the ruler of the most powerful empire in the world at that time, that man would find his heart conquered by the charm and beauty of a Jewish orphan named Esther. When the opportunity came, she would use her influence with the king to save her people from annihilation. The book that bears her name is not written by Esther, but is about her. Maybe the author the Holy Spirit used was her relative Mordecai, or Ezra, or Nehemiah, or another Jew dwelling in Persia. Whoever wrote this history possessed a detailed knowledge of Persian customs in history, as well as Jewish features, including a strong sense of Jewish nationalism. They all play richly in this remarkable story. Scene 1. The first queen is deported. The book opens by describing the expansive kingdom of Ahasuerus, noting that the Persian Empire extended from Ethiopia to the western edges of India. Ahasuerus was the grandson of Cyrus the Great. Remember who Cyrus the Great was? He was the Persian ruler who allowed the Jews to return home after 70 years of captivity in Babylon. Though many Jews went back to Israel at that time, many remained settled and scattered throughout the Persian Empire. Several years into his reign, Ahasuerus summoned the princes and nobles of Persia to attend a 6-month summit in the capital city of Shushan, also called Susa. This gathering, which occurred in 483 BC, was a strategic war planning meeting during which the king and his royal advisors made final preparations for the aforementioned invasion into Greece. Confident that his military forces would be triumphant, Ahasuerus concluded the summit with a 7-day banquet for the entire city of Shushan. Esther 1, verses 6 and 7 describes the extravagant celebration of the anticipated victory. There were white linens and blue linen curtains fastened with cords, and fine linens and purple and silver rods and marble pillars. The couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. On the 7th day of the feast, Ahasuerus, after a week of indulgence and intoxication, commanded his wife, Queen Vashti, to appear before his nobles in all her royal regalia. Surprisingly, Vashti refused, evidently concerned that her dignity would be tarnished by appearing before a crowd of drunken onlookers, and it's also possible that the queen was pregnant with their son, and therefore uncomfortable to be seen in public. One source stated she could have been against the war, and this was her way of protesting. Whatever his wife's excuse might have been, Ahasuerus was furious when he heard she was unwilling to obey him and appear for all his guests. After discussing the public insubordination and embarrassment with his royal advisors, who also feared that the queen's actions might spark a woman's liberation movement, Ahasuerus decided to demote Vashti and find himself a new queen. As was customary in the Persian law, the king announced his intentions by issuing an unalterable decree. It was sent to every corner of the Persian Empire, declaring that because Vashti had disobeyed the king, her exalted position would be given to someone more deserving of it. Though harsh, Ahasuerus was making his point unmistakably clear. No one, not even the queen, could refuse a royal order and get away with it. As his response to Vashti demonstrates, Ahasuerus had a violent temper. Just a year later, in order for his massive army to march from modern-day Turkey into Greece, Ahasuerus ordered bridges built across Hellespont, the narrow strait of water that runs from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. But when the bridges were destroyed in a storm before the troops were able to cross, Ahasuerus became infuriated. According to ancient Greek history, the Persian emperor ordered the engineers who designed the bridges to be beheaded. If you think that was bad, listen to what he does next. He then sent soldiers into the water with whips, demanding they lash the ocean 300 times for his insubordination. His soldiers also threw shackles into the water and stabbed the waves with red-hot branding irons, all to soothe the king's arrogant and irrational rage. He was definitely off his meds, wasn't he? Vashti and everyone else learned that violating the will of the imperial dictator could have very serious consequences. Scene 2, a new queen is chosen. According to Esther 2:16, 4 years have passed before Ahasuerus got around to selecting a new queen. Even with all the necessary preparation, a new queen could have easily been enthroned within 2 years. So why did it take Ahasuerus so long to select Vashti's replacement? The answer is found in the Persian 2-year unsuccessful invasion of Greece, which historically fits right in between Vashti's demotion in 483 or 482 BC and Esther's coronation in 479 or 478. As noted earlier, Ahasuerus himself returned to Persia in 480, before the war's over. Frustrated by the situation in Greece, the king came back to his capital, Shushan, only to face the reality. He had no queen. With the war effort going badly, Ahasuerus needed a distraction. Selecting a new queen was the perfect diversion. Esther 2 states, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what decree against her. Then the king's servants who attended him say, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the cathedral, into the women's quarters under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beautiful preparation be given them. Then let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. At this point, the Bible text introduces to us two main characters of the book of Esther, two Jewish cousins who were living in the city of Shushan. They were descendants of the Jewish captives who had been taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and brought to Babylon over a century earlier. The older of the two, a man named Mordecai, was roughly 15 older than his younger cousin, an orphan named Esther. Because Esther's parents had died when she was very young, Mordecai had raised her as his own daughter. The biblical text describes the young virgin Esther as lovely and beautiful, and her external beauty did not go unnoticed to the king's officials, so she was taken to the palace to live with the other beauties for the contest of queen. According to Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, 400 virgins were selected as queen candidates from among the 25 million who lived in the empire. There was a year of beautification and primping, leading to the final preparation when a virgin would go before the emperor, not only to look as pretty as possible, but also smelling good, with the aid of incense and cosmetic burners in order to enhance the skin and hair with pleasant fragrance. Special instructions was also given regarding the etiquette of the imperial court, and especially expectation for royal concubine. In the end, 12 months of intensive preparation came down to one opportunity to impress the king. For that all-important encounter, each lady was allowed to adorn herself with whatever apparel or jewelry she decided. She would then be presented to the ruler. The day after, she would join the other concubine in another part of the palace. There she would wait indefinitely as a member of the royal harem, hoping the king would choose her from among the 400. Esther was likely in her 20s when, after completing the year-long ordeal, she appeared before Ahasuerus, according to Esther 2, verses 16 to 18. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which was the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all of his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the province and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. Like an ancient Cinderella story, Esther stole the king's heart and became his queen. Significantly, though, through this entire process, Esther kept her Jewish identity a secret, just as Mordecai instructed her to do so. This was likely due to the strong anti-Semitism that existed in the Persian Empire at that time. Esther would reveal her ethnic heritage, but not until the situation left her with no other option. Scene 3, Mordecai fouls a sinister plot. One day, not long after Esther was crowned, her cousin Mordecai was sitting at the entrance of the palace. There he evidently overheard a plot to assassinate Ahasuerus. As the text explained, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay the hands on King Ahasuerus. These royal officials likely guarded the king's private quarters and may have been angry because of loyalty to the recently disgraced Queen Vashti. They had the motive and needed only the opportunity to make an attempt on the king's life. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when the inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows, as it was written in the books of the Chronicles in the presence of the king, Esther 4:22 and 23. Importantly, very importantly, Mordecai's actions was written down in the royal records, which would be used in a future day as the basis for being rewarded by the king. Like all ancient monarchs, Ahasuerus was careful to honor and reward those who demonstrated their loyalty to him. Thus, it was required to keep a record of notable acts of valor and special services rendered to the Persian monarch. According to the great Greek historian, Ahasuerus would even do this in the midst of the battle. Whenever Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, saw one of his own men achieve some feat in battle, he inquired who did it, and his scribes wrote down the captain's name, along with his father's name and the city of residence. The record of the brave soldier would lead to appropriate honor for the loyal service. Scene 4, Haman hatches a diabolical plan. In the 3rd chapter of Esther, we're introduced to the villain, Haman, a man whom the king had exalted above other princes and royal officers. From his introduction on, we are reminded that Haman was an Agagite, a designation repeated throughout the book several times. Though he was an Agagite is no small detail. It was the origin of Haman's deep resentment towards the Jews and his effort to eliminate them. To get the point, we need to understand that the hostility between the Agagites and the Jews went back almost 1,000 years to the Exodus from Egypt. When the Israelites were attacked by the Amalekites, who were descendants of Esau, for that attack, God cursed the Amalekites and prophesying that one day they would become extinct. 4 centuries later, King Saul conquered the Amalekites and captured the kings whose name was Agag. Saul had ordered to kill Agag, but disobeyed, letting him live, and incurred the Lord's displeasure. The prophet Samuel finally executed God's command and hacked the pagan Amalekite king Agag to death. Haman was a descendant of Agag, who carried long nurtured feelings of this intense hatred towards the Israelites because they had defeated the Amalekites and put Agag to death. The plot thickens when we realize that Mordecai was a descendant of Kish, a man from the tribe of Benjamin, who was from the line of, guess who? Saul. Though 550 years had passed, Saul and Agag, neither Haman the Agagite nor Mordecai the Benjamite, descendant of Saul, had forgotten the tribal feud that still smoldered deep beneath the surface. And I thought the Hatfields and the McCoys were bad. Anyway, that hostility erupted when the two men met. In Esther 3, it is recorded, all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai, for they told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. The generality of the hostility between the Amalekites and the Israelites explains why Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman, and why Haman responded so viciously, plotting not only to kill Mordecai, but to exterminate the entire Jewish population. Full of anger, Haman sought the advice of the Persian magicians and astrologers, who cast lots to determine the optimum day on which the annihilation of the Jewish people. He then went to the king and deceitfully, purposely misrepresented the Jews as a rebellious threat to the empire that needed to be eliminated. Haman proposed that all Jews living within the Persian Empire ought to be killed, including those who had even returned to Israel. In order to sweeten his proposition, Haman promised that, by destroying the Jews, a vast sum of money would be coming to the royal treasury from the spoils they left. Trusting the advice of his chief counselor, and falsely thinking he was going to squelch a rebellion before it happened, Ahasuerus gave the signet ring, it's a very important act, gave his signet ring to Haman and told him to use it to authorize the genocide. Haman hit the track fast, dispatching a royal decree throughout the entire Persian Empire that set aside a day, 11 months later, for one deadly purpose: to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young, old, little children, and women. The Persian courier system operated like an ancient version of the Pony Express, as messengers rode from one outpost to the next. Scene 5, Mordecai's petition to the queen. When Mordecai heard about the genocidal decree, he tore his clothes, dressed himself in rags, and poured ashes on his head, and mourned publicly. Undoubtedly, Mordecai realized that his earlier actions, refusing to bow down to Haman, contributed to this extermination as an act of retaliation. Haman's vengeful plan for the mass murder of the entire Jewish population, however, went far beyond the simple payback for Mordecai's disrespect. Mordecai informed Esther of what Haman had succeeded in accomplishing and sent Habash back with her with a copy of the royal decree. He also urged her to plead with the king on behalf of the lives of the Jews. Mordecai's plan for Esther's appeal sounded simple enough, but was considerably much more complicated. In Persian, no one, including the queen, could appear before the king without his express invitation. This helped to protect the emperor from unwanted intruders, which was an important precaution at a time when assassination attempts were not uncommon. If a would-be guest showed up uninvited and the king did not extend his royal scepter as a sign of welcome, the intruder could be killed on the spot. In order to comply with Mordecai's request, Esther not only would be breaking royal protocol, but risking her life. She explained the reality to her cousin. All the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king who has not been called, he has one law: put all to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he might live. Yet I myself have not been called to go to the king in 30 days. That was Esther 4:11. Esther was understandably afraid of her potential violent and irrational husband, who had demoted and publicly disgraced Vashti for one act of noncompliance. Mordecai was putting Esther in a position to disregard the law and approach the king uninvited. The fact that Ahasuerus had not called on her for 30 prior days only increased Esther's apprehension. Perhaps she wondered, had she fallen out of favor? Or has his affection for her turned indifferent, such that he would not show her no mercy? Mordecai's response urged Esther to be courageous given the seriousness of the situation. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews, he warned his royal cousin. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet you know whether you have come to this kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai's question was indirect affirmation of divine sovereignty. Though he did not specifically mention God's involvement, he understood that Esther's placement in a place was not the product of chance. In his purpose, God had given her a royal position for such a time as this. Finally, embracing her divinely granted role, Esther responded with courage and resolve. Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Even if it cost her life, Esther would do whatever was necessary to protect her people. Though Esther reply does not mention prayer, it was traditionally a part of any Jewish fast. So for 3 days, she and her fellow Jews prayed as she prepared herself to face the king. Esther approached the throne tensely, wondering what the king's response would be. The seconds felt like hours as she waited for Ahasuerus to acknowledge her presence. Then it happened. He looked at her and extended his royal scepter to her, eagerly welcoming his beauty and into her presence. To underscore his delight, the king responded with a question marked by generosity in a typical royal hyperbole. What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half of the kingdom. Now, Esther, she didn't want half the kingdom or any part of it. She wanted the lives of her people. So Esther replied with a simple request that Ahasuerus and Haman join her for a banquet later that day. The king was both obliged by his pledge and delighted to be with her. In Esther 5, it's reported, so the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half of the kingdom. It shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petitions and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them tomorrow, and I will do as the king has said." She's a thinking, isn't she? Okay. Once again, the king's affection for Esther is clearly revealed that he repeated his promise to give her whatever she wanted, and for a second time, the queen invited him and Haman to a banquet. Esther knew how critical it was that her real request be made when the timing was right. It appears the first feast was not the optimum time, so she decided to wait until the following day to petition the king on behalf of her people in the presence of her enemy, Haman. Scene 6. Haman's hatred for Mordecai intensifies. Haman left the feast feeling confident about himself, about his achievement. Not only had Ahasuerus exalted him above all the other princes and royal officials, but Queen Esther. Queen Esther herself invited him not to one, but to 2 exclusive banquets as the guest of the royals. No higher honor could be given. You think his ego was about to explode? I imagine if it was today that was happening, I can imagine old Hama just skipping down the road going zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay, just happy as can be. But on the horizon, there's storm clouds of brewing, and rain is about to come on his parade. As Haman started back to his house after the evening with the monarchs, he noticed Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. That sight triggered rage in his heart. Arriving at home, he gathered his family and friends and expressed his disdain towards Mordecai. They suggested a quick and easy remedy: erect gallows and have Mordecai executed in the morning. It seemed like a perfect solution to Haman, so he quickly had the gallows constructed. That night, while Haman slept soundly and dreamt of his revenge, Ahasuerus tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Whatever the cause of his insomnia, the king called for the royal records to be read to him. If anything could put him out for the night, it would be listening to the details of government reports from imperial archives. The Persians kept extensive records, so it was only by the hand of divine providence that one particular document was selected and read that night. Anybody want to guess which document that was? Right. It was the account of Mordecai's action to expose the two conspirators who were plotting to kill the king. In Esther 6, we find, it was found written that Mordecai had told of the Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeeper who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." Mordecai had reported the assassination plot to Queen Esther 5 years earlier, but he had gone unrewarded. A grateful Ahasuerus was eager to rectify the oversight. Meanwhile, early in the next morning, Haman arrived at the royal court with another deadly request, that the king would authorize the execution of Mordecai. But before he could say anything, Ahasuerus posed an open question to him. What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Since that the king was referring to him and being so generous as to give him what he thought he should read, Haman was glad to answer. He eagerly rattled off a grandiose list, including wearing a royal robe, riding on one of the king's horses, and having a prince lead the horse throughout the city while proclaiming, "Thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Those were honors Haman couldn't wait to enjoy. In a shocking twist of expectations, he heard Ahasuerus say to him, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken." Why wouldn't that just take the wind out of your sails? Filled with humiliation, shame, and rage, Haman had no chance but to do what he was told. So he arrayed Mordecai in splendor and led him throughout the city, making the proclamations of praise to him as he went. Utterly disgraced, Haman hurried home. If he was looking for comfort from his family and friend, he didn't find it. According to verse 13, when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you began to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." Their ominous words would soon prove to be prophetic. The tables had been turned, the plot was thickening, and it was pressing on Haman. Scene 7, Esther pleads for her people. Later that same day, Haman went back to the palace to attend the second banquet with the king and queen. He undoubtedly tried to steady his heart rate after what had happened that morning, trying to convince himself that somehow he would survive. Haman, however, was in for another horrifying surprise. The king, overwhelmed by affection for his queen, asked Esther, what is this that she wanted? This time the queen did not hesitate. Expressing angst that was heavy on her heart soul, with tears in her eyes and a quiver in the voice, she pleaded, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me at my petition and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated." Ahasuerus could not believe what he was hearing. To threaten the queen's life was the height of treason. Instantly, the king demanded to know, "Who is he, and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" As he watched himself become the object of the drama, Haman's mind must have really been reeling. The noose was tightening around his own neck. Surely the queen was not a Jew, was she? How could he have missed such an important detail? Haman didn't have long to think about what his stupidity blundered, only until he heard Esther, with her hand pointed at the red-faced dinner guest, answered with these words, The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. Gorged with fury, the king arose and stormed out into the palace garden. In that moment, he must have remembered the empire-wide program that Haman had convinced him to authorize a couple months earlier. He'd been swayed at the time based on Haman's misrepresentation of the Jewish people as a potential threat to the empire. Now the king realized he had been conned into making an unalterable decree that meant the death of his own queen. Still inside and at the table, Haman faced his doom. He fell at Esther's feet in front of the couch where she sat. In desperation, he begged for his life. Ahasuerus returned from the garden, blinded by anger, interpreted Haman's outstretched plea for mercy as another act of violence against the queen. With a roar of passion rage, he cried out indignantly, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" Instantly, royal guards covered Haman's face and led him away to be executed. In an ironic reversal, Haman's body was hanged on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. What a difference a day makes. 24 hours earlier, Haman had been at the top of his political career, boasting to his family and friends about his royal success and happily plotting the demise of his archenemies, Mordecai, along with all the Jews. That was yesterday. Today, the king would execute him as an enemy of the state. The king also exalted Mordecai in the royal court. Esther's risky and courageous action not only saved Mordecai's life, but also canceled a decree to destroy the Jews. Or did it? There's still a hurdle in this cancellation. According to Persian law, the king's edicts could not be what? Could not be reversed. So the order is still in place that when doomsday has come, all the Jews are to be executed and annihilated. But as Ahasuerus gladly allowed Esther and Mordecai to execute Plan B. Plan B was to issue an official counter decree enabling the Jews to defend themselves when their enemies tried to fulfill that decree. They were going to fight fire with fire. Haman's decree had been made 2 months earlier, giving Esther and her people nearly 9 months to prepare their defenses. On top of that, because of Mordecai's exaltation within the Persian governments, we find in Esther 9, all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. On March the 7th, 473 BC, the Jews not only defended themselves, able in defeating their enemy throughout the Persian Empire, but in the capital city of Shushan, they killed 510 who opposed them. Another 300 on the following day. Throughout the empire, an additional 75,000 enemies were slain. The day intended for their destruction became a great day of victory. Not only were the Jews not annihilated, as Haman had planned, but their influence throughout the empire actually became stronger. Because of being a day to remember the extermination of the Jews, it became a day to celebrate their deliverance. To commemorate that, Mordecai established the Feast of Purim, a name derived from the Hebrew word for lots. Haman had cast lots to determine the day on which the execution of the Jews should occur. Yet in the end, it proved to be a day of triumph and celebration for the Jewish people. Because they continued to vanquish their enemy on the following day, the Feast of Purim became a traditional Jewish two-day celebration. It explains it in Esther 9, verse 22 to 28, and because of time restraints, well, I'll let you all read that yourself. That'd be Esther 9, verses 23 through 28. The annual two-day of feasting called Purim has been an event marked by rejoicing, food sharing, gift giving, and fasting. Though it's not mentioned in the scriptures outside of Esther, Purim has been celebrated throughout the centuries in Israel by Jews everywhere, in remembrance of that day long ago when the Jews were providentially rescued from their enemy. This year in 2021, it was February the 25th and 26th that feast was held. Long after Haman was hanged, Mordecai and Esther continued to flourish in the royal house of Ahasuerus. The king exalted Mordecai to second in command over the entire empire, as Joseph and Daniel had been. Mordecai was elevated to a position of immense power and influence. His experience as an individual, going from the brink of death as a lowly target of hatred to the high power of a recipient of royal honor, was representative of the experiences of the Jews throughout the land. Against all odds, Esther, Mordecai, and the Jews had been spared, and not only spared, but elevated. Thus, the book of Esther ends with these happy-filled words. For Mordecai, the Jew, was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all of his countrymen. Got a question, though. Where is God in the book of Esther? The real hero of this story was never mentioned, never even named. But every reader knows who he is and sees his heroic acts of power. God himself is the only explanation for the survival of the Jews in the midst of such hatred and opposition. His hand of providence is in every large event, even small detail, as he protects and preserves his people. The Song of Solomon and Esther are the only two books of the Bible where no reference to God is made. The book of Esther might be compared to a chess match in which God and Satan, working behind the scenes, moved real-life kings, queens, and nobles. It looked as though Satan, using Haman, might put God's plan in check, but the Lord, who has absolute power over Satan, checkmated the devil's scheme by positioning Mordecai and Esther to find favor with the king. The Lord is still on the throne of the universe, just as he was in Esther's day. He is absolutely sovereign over the governments and earthly rulers of today. Though the news reports rarely mention his name, God is the unseen power behind all of it, perfectly orchestrating the details to accomplish his purpose. Does Romans 8:28 come to mind? In the words of Psalms 103, verse 19, the Lord has established his throne in heaven. His kingdom rules all over the world. What a comfort that is to all of those who have put their trust in him. Let's go to our Father in prayer. Father, we come to you as just in awe, the awe of your wisdom, of your power, in awe, Father, of how you take care of us as humans. Father, as in Esther's time, you orchestrated the plan to save the Jewish people. Father, we know that you are in control. We know that we live in a world that is, it's the world of Satan. But Father, we realize that we are part of your kingdom, Father, and we thank you for that. We thank you for looking after us and taking us. And Father, We look forward for the day that we can join you in our new home to live there happily ever after. Amen. You know, I'd like to thank everybody again for being here and for tuning in. And remember, look for opportunities to be in the arms of Christ. Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay. My, oh my, what a wonderful day.